my boyfriend and I decided to go out to the gorge for some quality time camping. We had always gone with several other people, but this was the first time. It was just us two when we got out of our car to prep our gear for the mile hike back to the camping spot. Two sketchy-looking dudes came out of the trailhead, eyed us, and went back onto their old-school Volkswagen camper van. I had a weird feeling, but shrugged it off and proceeded back to our camping spot. We had previously camped in the same area a handful of times, and I knew it pretty well. Once we got back there, I knew of a handful of different camping spots and proceeded to check them all out for the one that would be ideal for us. He noticed what looked like someone camping further up the hill, so I picked a spot a little further down where we'd most likely be out of sight. Not out of earshot though, as I heard him yelling with someone else back over on the trail. It was starting to get dark by the time we got everything set up, so I figured I'd start looking for firewood. Suddenly this guy appears out of nowhere and asks us if we'd like any help, and offered to sell USA bundle of firewood for $10. He laughed, because we were in the woods, thus surrounded by wood, which I could pick up off the ground for free. He then said that I wouldn't find much, because they'd already cleared it out over the past few weeks. Few weeks? I asked him how long he'd been camping up there, and he said almost a month. Already had the creeps about him, and he claimed he was up there by himself. Asked him why I heard him yelling with someone then, and that he had referred to more people when he was talking about the wood, stammered and was like, yeah. There's some dudes I know camping over there, but up on the other side of the river. Then he proceeds to tell us that he's been lonely since he arrived. He's from Pennsylvania, took a bus to Lexington, and had been living in the woods back behind where I currently work. I knew exactly where he was talking about because I saw some homeless people, immigrants, and drug addicts coming in and out of those woods every day. So basically, he was a homeless man who somehow got a ride out to the gorge and decided he would just live there. Instead, he had been living on snake's bugs and selling firewood for money. But he said we were the first people he'd seen in a few weeks. His stories were all over the place, and I know he was lying about a lot of what he told us. He wasn't alone, even if he claimed to be. He even took us to his camp, where there were tons of stuff for several guys. Not just one. He said he liked camping up top where he could see everything, and everyone then showed up. Our campsite, he had a straight shot view. By now it was dark, and he helped us get a fire going. I was trying to politely get him on his way back up the hill so I could have a minute to process all this. When he left, I started whispering to my boyfriend that there was no way in hell I could sleep without lying sketchy, homeless creep, right up the hill. He didn't have a gun knife, or even a dog to protect ourselves if we needed to. My boyfriend somehow convinced me to stay a little longer, so he planned to stay the night. But all throughout the night we heard twigs and branches snapping around our tarp as if somebody was watching us. It was that man. I knew it was. He was standing out there watching us. I said, "Let's quietly get our together and get the hell out of there." Which we did, only we left our new tarp set up because they would make too much noise and he'd know we were leaving as soon as I stood up with my pack, ready to get the hell out of there. He yells, weaving so soon, we proceeded to get away from there as quickly as possible. The most disturbing thing as we were getting away from there, the man yelled for us to come back. That only made us go even faster. In my mind, we were either getting robbed, raped, killed, or something, because he was not alone. His stories didn't add up, and his background of where he came from made me believe he was running from something and was trying to hide by living off the grid. I called the Rangers the next morning and told them about him. Luckily, all he got from us was a set of new tarps. It's not like there's anything that can be done about it. Now, she's gone, I've got a van reserved for next week, and I'm gonna load up and head out of here. I've got a job in another city. Maybe between the move and whatever this is supposed to be, I can leave it all behind me. I had a girlfriend. I don't want to use her real name, so I'll call her Susan. We moved in together, and for a couple of years it was great. We went on adventures together. That's what she'd call it. She'd just get this idea in her head, and off we went, like seeds from a dandelion drifting wherever her wind took us. Sometimes it was trips like when we went to Mammoth Cave. Another time, we got our belly buttons pierced together. And sometimes it was something simple, like trying a coffee shop on the other side of town. I think that's why I have to move. There are memories of her everywhere. I see her smile, hiding around every corner. She liked to do things outdoors. Nothing too crazy. We did some camping trips, but it wasn't more than driving up and unloading our tent. She loved day hikes, though. 4 miles 10. She'd always find interesting places for us to go to, and it was on one of these trips that everything just went wrong. It was someplace we'd hiked before, one of the parks just outside the city. It had a number of trails of varying difficulty, and we'd hiked all of them at some point or another. That day we were taking the long loop, the one that ran way out past the river. It had a couple of inclines that were pretty steep, but nothing really crazy. It was just a nice day, and our apartment felt too small. That's what she said when she suggested we go. She felt like she was suffocating. So I got my hiking boots, and off we went. I wonder if there were signs of some kind, a sort of indicator that something was wrong. But I've walked that trail so many times, and it all blurs together in my head, and I can't remember if anything was out of the ordinary. There was nothing that stood out until we saw the sign, Witch Valley Loop. It read, 25 miles. We'd never seen the Witch Valley Loop before. But this was a pretty big park, and there was lots of land that didn't have trails running through it yet. They could have opened up a new trail. Susan was excited because this meant there was a new adventure in front of us. Someplace we hadn't been before. We were planning on taking a different 25-mile loop anyway, so there was really no reason to not try the new trail. It was a weird name. I thought I'd expect to see that sort of thing in New England, but here you were more likely to see names that either referenced the indigenous people or natural landmarks. I figured we'd find out at some point when we reached a sign with interesting facts about the area. The trail dipped steeply, taking us down into a valley. As promised, I began to grow uneasy immediately. Everything about the trail felt like I was straying into some foreign place, and I was no longer so confident of where I was. I felt like we were losing ourselves in the forest with every step. It was the trees. The trees changed. The maple and oak trees that dominated the park dwindled as we descended, replaced by an old pine forest. The underbrush vanished. The forest floor was an open carpet of pine needles. There were few birds and fewer animals, and the wind did not descend this far into the valley. I felt like we were intruding as the silence encased us. I wanted to turn back. But Susan was excited. It was someplace new after all, and that same unease that drove me to leave was what drove her forward. The path flattened out and forked. We'd arrived at the start of the loop. As expected, there was a sign marker, but it wasn't like the others placed throughout the park. It was made entirely of wood with carved letters. No printouts with graphics and maps. No plastic covering. We leaned over it, reading the handful of words engraved on its surface. Only the children may go. All else must stay. Susan. And I stared at it for a moment, and then looked up at each other. Her face was bright and animated. I'd been with her long enough to know what was going through her head. This was no longer a mere hike. This was a mystery. Maybe they're getting ready for a Halloween event. I suggested. We probably shouldn't be down here if that's the case. The trail wasn't blocked off. Maybe they forgot. It wasn't hard to see that I was trying to find a reason to turn back. Susan made a pouty face at me and seized my wrist. It was only a 25-mile loop, she urged, and the trail down into the valley was surely 5 miles already. We wouldn't be down here that long. We'd walk fast, be back at the sign in no time, and then we could leave and ask the park rangers what the new trail was all about. I gave in. I loved her. I loved her enthusiasm. It overwhelmed my reservations as it always did. We didn't make it back to the sign. I'm not sure at what point we realized we weren't getting out of there. There was that uncertainty at first, when we confirmed we were still on the trail and tried to remember if we'd seen any branches. The sudden stab of fear when we got out our phones and found that we had no service and could not check a map. And then the helplessness as we walked that trail over and over, trying to find the sign, a fork something. We arranged piles of pine needles in the middle of the path, hoping to find them again and know we'd completed a loop. We never saw them again, and there were no landmarks, just the endless pine trees to either side of the dirt path. I think I really started to be afraid when sunset came, and we were still in Witch Valley. Susan couldn't explain what was happening, nor could I. We got angry. We fought a little, and then we both cried a bit. This wasn't either person's fault. We agreed. We'd gotten into this together, and so we'd get out of it together. In the meantime, we had to figure out how to last out here, with very little water, no food, and no shelter. We didn't expect anyone to come looking for us until Monday. The park rangers might find our car left in the parking lot and realize someone was missing, but we decided not to count on that. We'd gone hiking on a Saturday, so that meant 2 nights of waiting before the search even began. We'd save the water for as long as we could stand it. We could go without food, and we wouldn't leave the trail. That would only make our situation worse, Susan reasoned. If we got lost in the woods, then it would be even harder for rescuers to find us. We considered seeing if we could make a fire. No fallen branches, no stones, nothing but a thick carpet of pine needles. It wasn't worth the risk of venturing further off the trail, Susan reasoned, as it wasn't getting that cold at night yet. We found a tree close to the trail and put our backs to it, curled together, and watched. It was dark in Witch Valley, oppressively dark. My heart hammered as I stared into the night, barely able to see the trunks of the pine trees. It was an overcast night, and we didn't even have moonlight to help us. We didn't have flashlights, and we'd decided to conserve as much of our cell phone batteries as possible. Mine was turned off. We'd leave Susan's on, as she had a higher chance of family or friends calling her on a whim. Perhaps we'd get lucky, and service would reach us down in the valley, or perhaps they'd wonder why she wasn't answering. Then we tried to sleep. I felt safer with Susan beside me. At least I wasn't alone. We were together. Still, it was hard to fall asleep. It felt like I spent hours like that, with my head resting against hers, eyes closed, so that I didn't have to see the darkness around me, swallowing up the valley in its embrace. When I did sleep, it was lightly. I only dozed. And so when something found us, I woke up. It wasn't trying to be quiet. Its footsteps were heavy, and while they were cushioned on the thick mat of pine needles, the forest was silent enough that its footsteps felt like they echoed. I felt Susan's hands tighten around mine. Her nails hurt, where they dug into my skin, and I couldn't be upset, because I was doing the same thing to her. The creature stopped at the entrance to our shelter. It wasn't much of a door, not even big enough for a person. We'd stepped in, and then pulled our makeshift roof of branches and needles up over us. There was still a cloud cover, but enough light filtered through that I could see human feet. Bare feet, pale ankles. For a brief moment I thought we were saved, but then I thought, why are they barefoot? Come, a female voice whispered. Come. It sounded like she wasn't talking to us. The roof of our shelter was ripped away. The walls quickly collapsed. Susan and I cowered, staring up in horror at a bear. It towered over us. Its fur was matted, hanging down its chest like a dress. Its eyes were white with wide pupils, human eyes. Frantically, I glanced down at its legs, human legs, and I realized human hands, human body, a woman's body. But from the shoulders up, she was a bear. She opened her snout and I saw the sharp white teeth inside. "Come to me," she called one last time, and the animals began to come out of the forest. Deer squirrels, chipmunks. There was something immense near the back of their ranks that I swear was a moose. They walked towards us through the pine trees, and all of their eyes shone white in the scant light. So many unblinking human eyes. "Run," Susan screamed. Her hand was a vice on my wrist. I scrambled to my feet after her, and we ran away from the advancing horde of animals fleeing mindlessly through the valley. The bear woman watched us go. Why would she bother giving pursuit? She knew it was futile. We were two scared humans, frail and lost, and we were being pursued by the denizens of the woods. The deer caught up first. One hit Susan bodily, knocking her down. I tried to hang on to her. I tried. But the force of the blow was too great, and she was torn from my grip. I slowed and started to turn, started to go back for her. But the deer were grabbing hold of her shirt and dragging her backwards. The squirrels and chipmunks were catching up and swarming her legs. "Run," she screamed at me, and her eyes pleaded with me to do just that, to save myself. I think about that late at night, when I can't sleep. If I should have stayed, if she regretted letting me go and dying alone, or if it brought her some comfort, knowing that I had a slim chance of survival. If it was a welcome escape in her last moments, believing I was safe, I ran. And her cries as she struggled to free herself from the animals echoed through the trees. Then they went silent, and then I heard her screams. They too went silent. I half ran and half stumbled through the woods. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just knew I had to keep going. There were shadows in the forest, and I told myself they were just the product of a mind blind with terror. For nothing came for me out of the night. The bear woman seemed content to let me go. The animals were no longer pursuing, and when the first light of the sun came over the treetops, I found the trail. I followed it. It took me to the fork. The sign. The way out of the valley. I think this wasn't an accident. I think the bear woman let me go. Exhausted, nearly blind with tears. I climbed the trail up and out of the valley. I would have given anything to have Susan beside me, but I knew that she was gone. That scream there was too much fear in it, too much pain, and it had ended far too abruptly. Susan had beautiful eyes. They were hazel. I loved everything about her, but her eyes were what I noticed the most. How they seemed to glow with an inner light. And when I looked back down into Witch Valley, there at the top of the trail, where the pine trees vanished entirely, giving way to the familiar maple and oak, I saw a squirrel sitting on the path. It had hazel eyes. It's been a month. They never found her body. How could they when the valley doesn't exist in any way they're familiar with? I was careful with what I told them, that we got lost, that we were separated, and eventually they called the search off. There hasn't been a funeral yet. No one is ready to admit that she's gone. But me, I know she's gone. I'm trying to move on. Trying to work through my grief. I don't go into the woods anymore. I'm going to get an apartment in a big city and stay there. I don't feel safe where there's lots of trees. You see, I keep thinking of that sign. The one where the loop started. Only the children may go. All else must stay. Susan stayed behind. The bear woman kept her, as it's kept so many others. But then, why was I permitted to leave? This happened during a Boy Scout campout when I was 15. My friend, who was supposed to share the tent with me, called out from the trip at the last minute, so that meant I had to pitch the tent and sleep in it, alone. The sun was going down, and after a long day of hiking, we got back to camp to set up our tents. It was already dark at that point, and I was still trying to set it up. It wasn't as easy doing it yourself. Someone came over and finally helped me. And then, we ate dinner, after the cliched telling of scary stories around the campfire. We all went to sleep, I guess. I was a little happy that I had my own tent at that point. Since I had more room, I fell asleep quickly, but woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of somebody stomping around my tent. I immediately assumed it was another scout going to take a leak or something. You may be thinking that all our attempts were pitched right next to each other, but our scoutmasters actually had us pitch our tents far apart. So I was pretty far from my closest scoutmates. Is stomping around the tent seemed to just be going around in the circle. So at that point, I was sure somebody was messing with me. Asked who it was, and in response to that, they stomped off into the woods. I almost found myself going out and following them, but I figured it wasn't worth it and just tried to fall back asleep. But after that, it was hard to. Sure enough, the stomping came back and started circling the tent again. I was pissed off now, so I got up and unzipped the door to the tent. I was expecting to see another scout, but when I confronted the person making the noise instead, I saw a grown man, probably 6'5", in his mid-30s. My heart was racing, and I couldn't even gather up the courage to scream. The man gave me a creepy smile, and then brought his finger to his lips, signaling for me to be quiet. I did a quick 180 and sprinted to Manny Scoutmaster's tent, screaming like a baby. He ran out before I even reached the tent, and I told him about the man I saw. He and the other Scoutmaster ran over to my tent with one of the hunting rifles, but they didn't find the man. They did, however, pick up on the tracks the man left, walking around the tent. We were all told to bring our tents closer together, like literally right on top of each other. The trip was cut short the next day, and we all went home. They've never gone camping since, and I never will again. So me and a couple of my buddies went camping last summer alongside the Willamette River. We actually had a decent hike into the deep end of woods. We did some night fishing, listening to music, and basically drank to the point where everything was funny. Later in the night, I would guess, we finally called it a night somewhere past 2 a.m. I shared a tent with one of my buds, while the other two shared another 10. We heard them laughing about something. First, we left at the sound of their laughing, but it soon got annoying, and we yelled for them to shut up. One of them responded, "It isn't us." I sat up startled at the response. I came to realize that it was a sound of only one person laughing, and it didn't sound like either one of my friends, even in my drunk state. I realized how odd it was for somebody to be out this far in the woods, so late at night. The laughing gradually got closer and louder to our campout. My friend shot up and looked at me with a worried look on his face. I heard my other friend scream over to us that they were getting freaked out as the left and got even closer. I could make it out very clearly to be the laugh of a male, probably in his 30s or 40s. Sounded like he was as drunk as us messing around with friends, but we only heard his laugh. Nobody else. There was something indescribably creepy about his laugh too, as if it was missing something to it. You had to be there to understand what I mean. The laughing was now just at the edge of our campsite, but we couldn't hear any footsteps at all. Now that may not seem like a big deal. It was impossible to move through that without making noise finally. All of a sudden the laughing stops completely. We had no idea where whoever that was standing. as he hadn't made a single stepping sound. He sat there in silence, looking at each other. My friend was clearly freaking out, but he was keeping it together, the best he could. Finally, something broke the silence, the sound of something rubbing against the cottony fabric of the tent. We saw the outline of a hand, through the moonlight pressing on the tent. We both screamed at the top of our lungs. Before getting out of the tent, we ran as fast as we could through the woods, our other friends following us. After about 5 minutes of running, we somehow found our car. I actually puked from running so much before taking the wheel. I don't condone drinking and driving, but I still believe we were just in this situation. By far, the most horrific experience of my life. No idea who or what the hell that was, or what they wanted. After college, I went backpacking in the Canadian wilderness for a few weeks by myself. To put this in perspective, I was in the middle of nowhere. The nearest town was a 3-hour bus ride away, and I only saw one other person, who was from a distance. He was in a canoe. During the entire 7 days, I brought a few disposable cameras with me, as this was before digital cameras were too widespread. I took a lot of pictures when I got home. I had them developed, and took a look at them. The pictures were standard nature shots until Elle got about halfway through my first camera. There were 2 pictures of me, asleep in my tents, in my sleeping bag. I literally freaked out when I saw it, and I had a complete breakdown to this day. Have no idea how those pictures got taken. I haven't been camping since, and I sleep with my door open and my curtains shut, and I still get the paranoid feeling that whoever took those pictures is still watching me somehow.